really excited to talk to you today about this fascinating collection of archives we have from the Pittsburgh Folk Festival. This was a festival established in 1956 with the purpose of sharing information and celebrating traditional crafts, foods, music, and dance from the city's many local ethnic groups. It was originally sponsored by Duquesne University and held at the Syria Mosque, a large performance venue that has since been torn down, but was located in the Oakland neighborhood. The founders of the Folk Festival are these two men photographed here on screen. Father John Schlitt, who is also a history professor at Duquesne University, and Richard Crum, who was a choreographer with the Tamburitzins group, the local multicultural song and dance group. So Crum was a native of Minnesota, and there he had worked on the Festival of Nations. That was a long-running folk festival in St. Paul. And these two got to talking and thought that Pittsburgh would be ripe for a similar type of event here. Father Schlitt became the festival's director, and Crum would become the director of the festival's artistic program. But Father Schlitt had this other vision for the folk festival, which was to provide a counterpoint to the Soviet Union's expansion during the Cold War. He was also a staunch anti-communist, and at this point, he had already established a seminar where he explored what he viewed as the dangers of international communism at Duquesne University. He had created a local television documentary on the same topic. And his dual vision for the Folk Festival, I think, is really summed up by this quote from a newspaper article at the time. He said, "The Folk Festival is, quote, what America is, a common ground for these many cultures, each of which has made contributions to this country of ours. Lose sight of this and you have the monotonous national oneness that you have in Russia." And so what he's talking about there is during the 50s, this fear of the Soviet Union expanding into Central Europe, Eastern Europe, expanding its control and influence, and in the process, stamping out the national identities, customs, traditions, languages of those countries in favor of a Russian identity and language. So here we have on screen here a photograph of people doing a Latvian dance. It was countries like Latvia, Slovakia, Poland that so many immigrants had come from to Pittsburgh that were kind of in the sites of Russia during that time. And so the first folk festival included 18 different countries that were represented. And notably, 12 were under communist rule at that time. So there were a few that represented those countries from which immigrants came and first settled this area. So Scotland, Ireland, and Germany, but there were many Central and Eastern European countries that were represented that really represented that second wave of immigration that came here during the Industrial Revolution. There are also a few non-European countries represented, and on screen we have a photograph of the Chinese food booth. Israel and Lebanon were also countries that had representation at that first folk festival. So there were 3 mandatory components of the festival. Each group had to do all 3 of these things, otherwise they would not be able to participate. So there was a display booth that featured traditional crafts and information about that country. There was a food booth offering traditional cuisine, and that had to be homemade. It could not be outsourced to a restaurant or catering service. And then there was a song and dance performance. So on screen here, I have photographs representing those 3 different components. And participation was usually facilitated through a church or a fraternal organization. On screen, there's a photograph of the Lithuanian booth showing some traditional Lithuanian jewelry. The Lithuanian community was represented by St. Kazimierz Church, the Croatian Fraternal Union of America, organized participation from Croatian Americans. Those are just two examples of the groups that participated in the folk festival over time. The expectations of participants included not just those three components I just mentioned, but also funding and constructing the booths. And here on screen, we have a photograph of the Ukrainian group putting together their booth. They had to attend regular planning meetings throughout the year. And they were also on the hook to sell a certain amount of tickets. So these are groups that were participating. These are volunteer-run organizations. This could be a pretty high bar for groups to clear in order to participate. And there's evidence in the folk festival records that indeed some groups had trouble doing that, and they might miss a year or two because they couldn't meet all these requirements. So this idea of the folk festival serving as a counterpoint to Soviet expansion and representing multiculturalism here in the United States was also recognized by the Voice of America. Okay, that's the US radio station that at that time is really focused on countering Soviet propaganda. And so in 1958, they actually sent a team of reporters to Pittsburgh. They interviewed festival participants, they recorded some of the performances, and the resulting material was broadcast by Voice of America. And on screen, there's some dancers representing the traditional Bulgarian dance, Bulgaria being an example of a country where Voice of America would be broadcasting to. So during the 1960s, there were a number of changes. Duquesne University ended their sponsorship. The original founders stepped away. And that led to the involvement of Charles Kubelik, who actually had been involved since day one, but now he's stepping into a leadership role. His wife, Carol, would also become very involved as assistant director. And Charles would hold this position as festival director until his death in 1989. He organized Robert Morris University to step in and become the sponsor of the festival. And then the festival grew to such an extent that it outgrew the Syrian Mosque and moved to the much more expansive civic arena. And here we have a photograph of Charles on screen with an image of some festivities happening at the civic arena. You might have heard some music playing softly when you walked in today. That was a folk album called Folk Songs of Western Pennsylvania by Vivian Rickman. She was a noted folk singer. She released that album on the New York City's Folkways record label. And she was also really involved in the folk festival. She organized children's performances in the 1960s. And she would also perform American folk music, including African-American spirituals, at the folk festival. So in addition to the festival highlighting the cultures of immigrants, there was also always a component of sharing homegrown culture in music, things that had developed here in the United States. So it wasn't until 1970 that there was representation from an African-American group. And that was when Beatrice Vassar and Mabel Little organized a group that represented multiple African nations. Since the early days of the festival, people like Vivian Rickman, who was a civil rights activist, she recognized that there was this lack of African-American participation in the event. But according to a history in the Folk Festival archives that includes interviews from the founders and organizers of the Folk Festival, this wasn't an intentional exclusion. It was simply that no group had come to the festival at that point that could clear that could do all those requirements that were necessary for participation, creating the booths, cooking the food, all that required time and money to accomplish. Later in the 1970s, there would be groups representing the individual countries of Nigeria and Ghana. And indeed, throughout as the festival went into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, other groups started to participate, including groups representing Asian countries like the Philippines, Korea, India. There's also a group representing Turkey, a group that represented multiple Latin American countries. And on screen, we have a photograph of a traditional Filipino dance. In the festival's later years, it moved to different venues, including Station Square, the Convention Center. Robert Morris University ended its sponsorship in 1992. And at that point, the festival became an independent nonprofit. And the last edition of the festival occurred in 2016 at Shenley Plaza. So the collection we have here at the History Center amounts to 14 boxes. And you have on screen a photograph of a sample of materials. These records were donated to us over a number of different occasions by Carol Kubelik and Michael and Maria Jula, who were leaders of the Ukrainian group that participated in the festival for many years. The collection includes correspondence. This is between the festival organizers and participating groups. There's administrative records, event programs, photographs. It really provides an in-depth view of the running, the planning of this festival. So the collection reveals, yes, just that, the coordination and challenges of the festival, the requirements of the groups in order to participate. It's also an example of the Cold War's influence here in Pittsburgh, and an example of the importance that was placed on multiculturalism during the mid-20th century. What I find really fascinating about this collection is not just the records that document the folk festival, but also all the records that document the participating groups. So there are tons of things like newsletters, programs, flyers that came from these different groups that were participating. And on screen here is an example of one. This is the Temple Times newsletter that was created by the Indian community here in Western Pennsylvania. It seems like the organizers of the festival were on the mailing lists of all these different organizations. And so they'd get all these newsletters, these event programs that were being sent out, and they saved them all and are in the Folk Festival archives. So you really get the sense of what these groups are doing apart from the festival too, throughout the year, the events they're planning, their communication with one another. So it is really a window in how these ethnic communities define themselves over time. So I thank you for your attention today. It was a pleasure talking to you about these materials.